Women's Day. And, with this specific webinar, we said, let's look at incredible women of the 21st century. And it is exciting that today we have Natasha as the first speaker for this webinar series. We're going to have 4 more speakers, all incredible women from across the globe. Today we're having Natasha as a speaker, and I'd like to really welcome everyone else that has joined us, especially you, Natasha. My name is Andres Malatelo, and I'm one of the facilitators at the Center for Civil Society. Like I said, this is a special webinar series where we're looking at celebrating and commemorating what has been done since 1956 and the women of the 21st century. Today we have Natasha, and then in this specific webinar, Natasha will be exploring the pivotal role of women in activism. She'll be shedding light on their invaluable contributions to creating positive change. She will also emphasize the empowering role of law as a tool to promote social justice for everyone in society. Natasha will delve into a thoughtful discussion of social justice movements with a particular focus on South Africa, where she foregrounds the significant role of women within those movements. A little bit about Natasha. She's a pro bono manager overseeing ENS Africa's CSI portfolio at Mitchell's Plain, Khayelitsha Township in the Western Cape and Alexander Township in Johannesburg. Her experience includes working with vulnerable individuals and groups, impacting litigation experiences, as well as training and advocacy. Natasha also has an experience in liaising with various stakeholders from both government and civil society, conflict resolution, legal administration, and she further has an interest in employment law, and she has completed a course focused on employment law through UCT Get Smarter. Furthermore, Natasha believes that training and development is an integral component of pro bono, and thus she has successfully completed a course focused on training and development through UCT Get Smarter. As ENS Africa's Mitchell's Plain pro bono manager, Natasha is responsible for managing the firm's pro bono and CSI programs. She's particularly interested in the pursuit of access to justice for all and matters involving socioeconomic rights issues, as well as foregrounding of the social aspects of ESG. She's also a reader and follower of Steve Biko. Natasha, having said that, I'd really like to welcome you to the Center for Civil Society. Like I said, it's always great to have incredible women within our space. Having said that, Danford will be facilitating today. And to everyone else, welcome to the center. Dan, over to you.
Thank you, Andres, for such a beautiful introduction. Thank you, Natasha, for joining us. My name is Danford Chibongodze. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow here at the Center for Civil Society. So I'll be facilitating this webinar. Thank you for being part of our special webinar. We are celebrating, women activism in Africa and across the globe. So thank you for giving us your time. So just for the ground rules, to the audience, please keep your mics on mute. So Natasha, I'll give you 30 minutes. So after that, to open the floor up for questions and further engagements from the floor. So the floor is yours, Natasha. Thanks again for being part of this special webinar series.
Thank you so much to you, Danford, to Moletelo, and to everybody present today. It is a great honor to be able to speak about a topic that is very close to my heart and one that I think should be close to everybody's, that being women in activism and the whole notion of social activism and using the law as a tool for social justice. Equal rights for women, although enshrined in countless pieces of legislation, conventions, treaties, and numerous laws across the globe, remains an elusive dream for many women. It has been said that women hold up half the sky, which I see as a rallying call for equality, for women to have equal access and equal opportunity. Sadly, in 2023, this is not the case for countless women across the world. Women make up more than half of the population, about approximately 50.42%, yet the 2022 World Economic Forum Global Gender Gap Report, which measures the gap between men and women and focuses on a host of topics to measure this, but in essence, economic participation and opportunity, health and survival, political empowerment, and covers approximately 146 countries, has indicated that the overall general gender parity score is 68.1%, which means that at the current rate, it will take a whopping 136 years to reach parity. Let that sink in. In essence, in our lifetime, all of us here today will not see gender parity. This is an indictment on humanity. Well, from what I've said and these stark statistics, it seems that there is no hope, but I refuse to believe that. And I believe in the spirit of humanity, in the activists that came before us and those that walk amongst us today, and in the activist movements that we see throughout the 19th, 20th, and in the 21st century, all championing for social justice, not just for women, but for all vulnerable groups. Now, in many aspects, we see that this social justice movement is made up of many facets. There's advocacy, there's education, there's various other lobbying, and there's also using the law as a tool. Sometimes people have said that the law isn't particularly sharp as a tool, but I beg to differ, particularly within the realm of impact litigation. The law can be used creatively to make sustainable change for groups of people, for communities, to change existing precedent. So definitely it's a key tool that we have for social activists and for social justice movements to make a sustainable change. Now, as was mentioned previously, yesterday we commemorated that iconic march where 20,000 women came together, women of all races, of all social standings and structures and socioeconomic conditions, came together behind a common cause, that being the extension of passes towards women, who marched fearlessly to the union buildings and said, "Not in our name. You strike a woman, you strike a rock." And it was successful. Passes were not extended to women. And I've been thinking over the past few days of this concept of you strike a woman, you strike a rock. The concept of woman being the rock of our society. And we can see in many instances, this does in fact ring true. Women are in lots of instances the cornerstone of our societies. When turning to the concept of social activism, we see that this is not a new concept. It has been around for many, many centuries. And there are many permutations of social activisms and with it many definitions. But for the purposes of today, let us define social activism loosely as the practice of working towards the sustainable reforms of relations, behaviors, bias, institutions, and expectations in community and society in general. And furthermore, let us look at the various causes. This is by no means an exhaustive list of causes, but generally a lot of trends emerge whereby we see that social activists and social activism rallies behind causes to ensure equal access to resources. We see today that there is by no means equal access to resources across our society. South Africa has in fact been deemed the most unequal society in the world. We see that there is very real constructs such as spatial apartheid that is still very, very prevalent in our societies, despite heinous laws such as the Group Areas Act being abolished in our statute books. It is very much alive, arguably, in our society. We see that there's the call for equity, for equal rights, for equal opportunities, for equal participation in all spheres and sectors of society, for diversity to be foregrounded. We see that if we are more diverse, if our groupings, if our workspaces are diverse, are made up of people of different races, of different genders, different cultures, different religious groupings, we have a more diverse society and arguably a more stronger society. And this fits very squarely under the large umbrella of human rights. Now, there have been numerous social activist movements throughout history. If you look at the 19th century, we see the iconic suffrage movement, led by women, but not without its criticism because of its somewhat right-wing leanings in some instances, but it is an example of women coming together to further the cause of voting to be extended to women. We then see in the 20th century the larger feminist movement, which became an umbrella grouping led by women for women, made up of various groupings and various organizations that form part of this umbrella. For example, the Black feminist movement, later suffrage movements, and so forth, and how this spurred on by changes in society, changes in the bonne mores of society in particular, to bring about social change for women and for other vulnerable groups. We saw that there were particular social activists that campaigned for equal access for women, for right to bodily integrity, for that translated a lot of the times in the right to abortion. We see how this is a campaign and a social activist movement that is in by no means at an end. We see that in some instances in 2023, the rights that, particularly the right to abortion, has been virtually eroded in many states in the United States by that landmark judgment of Roe versus Wade virtually being overturned in many states, and how this disproportionately still affects particularly vulnerable women from lower socioeconomic standings and so forth, because they are not able to travel to states that have more liberal views with regards to that. And we can see how social justice activists and social justice movements are still rallying for this, and therefore the road never ends. It's a continuous battle to ensure that we make inroads and that inroads that are made are not eroded. When we turn to South Africa, we see that women have been at the forefront of numerous social justice campaigns and continue to be at the foreground of this. We see various icons that have emerged throughout the eras. We see one, Alice Victoria Kinloch, who I must admit I didn't know about, and that's an indictment on myself until I started doing research. She was a human rights activist born in Cape Town. She focused primarily on raising awareness, on advocacy of the heinous conditions that Black miners faced, particularly when gold was found and when diamonds were found. She was really a rallying call to try and improve conditions. She even would manage to go to the United Kingdom to have her voice heard, which was virtually unheard of in this era. We see in 1912 the formation of the Native and Colored Women's Association, ironically the same year that the ANC was found, although women were not allowed to be members of the ANC until about the 1940s. So we can see that sometimes even our liberation movements were conservative and only allowed women to join at a later stage. And this formation was formed as a response to the extension or the proposed extension of past laws to women in the Free State. Now, following this formation, it was eventually superseded by the Bantu Women's League in about 1913, 1914. And this Bantu Women's League participated in many passive resistance campaigns, and it was primarily focused against the extension of past laws. Now, what these two groupings, the earlier grouping and then the later Bantu Women's League, show that women rallied together, were able to take matters into their own hand and successfully advocate and mobilize that the past laws were not going to be extended to them. And it shows very early along how these groupings made an impact, right? We see certain icons that emerge, and these icons that I touch on very briefly, I'm not doing them any justice. And I must also say from the get-go that these are not the only women icons. We stand on the shoulders of giants, and there have been a plethora of women that have made up the social justice and movement and are social justice activists. But some of them that I can think of in the South African context is firstly Charlotte Matenge, who actually was the leader, the head of the Bantu Women's League. And she was one of the first women, if not the first woman, to get a university degree. She got it as a Bachelor of Science in the United States of America. She was a leader that was deeply rooted in social conscience. She was valiant in her pursuits. She was fierce. She even led a delegation to the then Prime Minister Louis Botha to discuss the extension of past laws to women. And for her social activist pursuits, she really faced a lot of repression and can be deemed to be one of the earlier icons of the social activist movement. Now, with the 20th century and the dawning of the 20th century, we see many more repressive laws, particularly with the National Party coming into power and the apartheid being the official law of the land, right? And we can see how women became at the forefront of fighting these heinous laws, being social activists and being pillars of the community, being rocks of the community to try and eradicate this using various tools, some of them advocacy, some of them mobilization. We see defiance campaigns, we see the Congress of the People, women all playing a pivotal role there, and also the use of the law as a tool. Now I'm going to go into some detail on some of the women. Like I said, by no means an exhaustive account, and then also chat about two cases just to show you in greater detail how the law can be used as a tool to effect social justice. So one such icon is Amina Kachalia. She was an astute political activist. She started off in the Transvaal Indians Congress. She then became the treasurer of the Federation of South African Women. She was a fierce advocate for women's rights in the fact that she actually created and started the Progressive Women's Union, Women's Progressive Union in 1948. And that was aimed at making women realize the importance of being financially independent. She really saw early on that financial independence was very important for women. She joined the ANC. She was very, very involved in the Defiance campaign, in the Women's March. She was a key member. She suffered many bannings, arrests, and so forth. And when apartheid was overturned and the first democratic elections came around, she was a member of parliament in that first setting of parliament. We also have another activist, Ida Theo Mchwana, who was elected as the first president of the ANC Women's League. She was also elected on the ANC's NEC, National Executive Council, in the 1950s. She was one of the leaders of the anti-pass campaigns. She also formed part of the Congress of the People, where the Freedom Charter was adopted. And she was also a defendant in the famous treason trial. So we see that both men and women were defendants in the treason trial. So therefore, both men and women during this time period were key activists. We also find an activist that paid the ultimate price, that being her life. And this person is Ruth First. She was born into a very politically astute family. Her father was one of the leaders of the Communist Party. She became a journalist, used her voice and her skills as a writer, despite the reprehensible rules and laws of apartheid, to write and talk about the conditions of people suffering under apartheid. As I mentioned, she paid with with that were her social activism with her life when she was killed by a letter bomb on August 17th, 1982. That anniversary is soon coming up. So I encourage all of us to take a moment of silence on the 17th of August to remember the sacrifice that Ruth made. Another social activist is Lillian Ngoyi. She was a key member of the 1956 march, a key member of the Defiance campaign. She also was on the ANC NEC. She was arrested, banned. She even endured solitary confinement, all in the pursuit of social justice and the rights of all people, all vulnerable groups in South Africa. So this is but a snapshot. And there are two cases that I want to chat about that shows how the law can be used as a tool for social justice. One of it is quite an earlier case that came before the Constitutional Court, and another one is a bit later. I'll first chat about some of the facts of the cases and then just show you how it all works within hand in hand with other tools that social activists have to bring about social change. The first case is Bev and others versus the Magistrate of Khayelitsha. And this was a case that was heard by the Constitutional Court in 2004. And it concerned African customary law, or codified version of African customary law, in particular the rule of primogeniture, whereby the first male would inherit everything. It was brought by a lady, Mrs. Bear, and her two daughters, as well as her late husband. And it concerned her view that now, because of this codified version of African customary law, her daughters were going to be precluded from inheriting. After much lobbying, advocacy, and so forth, it came before the Constitutional Court, and the court ruled, especially after the inputs of various amicus, which are friends of the court, one of them being the Commission for Gender Equality, which said that there's a difference between living African customary law and codified African customary law, and we need to take into account the living. And it was felt that also in light of the Bill of Rights, in particular the right to equality and so forth, that this was inconsistent. So the court overturned this, and the daughters were allowed to inherit, right? So this was where the submissions of the applicants were then upheld by the court. We have another judgment, which is much more recent. It actually came before the court last year in 2022, and that concerns the recognition of Muslim marriages. And essentially, the case centered around the non-recognition of Muslim marriages and how the Divorce Act and the Marriage Act didn't recognize these marriages, and therefore it was discriminatory. It precluded women's rights to equality, to dignity, and to access the courts. Now, the court ruled that this was discriminatory, that Muslim marriages should be recognized. They then said that the legislature had 24 months, we're in that time period still, to amend the law to allow for the recognition of Muslim marriages. Now, we oftentimes see this great ruling, right? And we say, wow, the court has made this ruling, impact litigation has been amazing. And it is a very sharp tool that we have, but we need to realize that there's a lot of lobbying, there's a lot of advocacy, there's a lot of education that happens that is spearheaded by social activists. And we need to take this and see how all of it works together to bring about change and what we hope to be sustainable change. And we also need to realize that, unfortunately, we don't live in a utopian society. We see that, as I mentioned earlier, we are the most unequal society in the world. We are plagued by gender-based violence, by femicide, by inequality, by the deadly and disastrous effects of climate change. And we need to draw on the inspiration of some of the activists that came before us and those that walk amongst us. And I'll mention a few a bit later. We see that we are faced with some really, really scary statistics. According to crime statistics for the period October to December 2021, 902 women were murdered, as well as 11,315 women were raped, which translates to roughly 123 rapes a day. And these are just the ones that are reported. How many go reported. So we see that we face many challenges, and it falls upon all of us to become social justice activists, to form part of campaigns, to form part of lobbying, to educate our various communities, to ensure that we raise awareness. We can see some of the icons that stand out, and these are by no means, once again, an exhaustive list. We see that there are social justice activists that are forming really strong formations to bring about change. The center being one of it, as a grouping to raise awareness and dedicate a series such as this so that we can raise awareness and we can have platforms where we can engage constructively. I just want to draw some highlights of some of the social justice activists that I look up to. For example, I see that there's Siam Sambai, who's an accomplished attorney, legal practitioner. She's the director of the Women's Legal Center, which actually brought the recognition of Muslim marriages to court and has had a long road of advocacy and lobbying. We see Tandile Chinya Banu, who is an environmental and social justice activist based in South Africa, forming part of Greenpeace and the lobbying to raise awareness against climate change. We see another lady, Jessica Dewhurst, who is an award-winning human rights activist and forms part of an organization, a grassroots organization called Justice Desk Africa, that has a footprint in numerous countries on the continent, striving to advocate for the rights of vulnerable people, to educate, to equip, to raise awareness. And I think that it's very important that we as a collective become social justice activists if we aren't already, that we also look at the realm of women's rights in particular, not just being within the purview of women, also looking at how men play a role in that and how men can be champions for women's rights, and how we all need to be social justice activists so that we can see, hopefully, gender parity in our lifetime, some of the greater access to resources, equality, see that we can try and bring down those statistics of femicide, of gender-based violence, create a culture that is foregrounded in human rights. We have a lot of icons that we can look back on that have played a great role in being social justice activists, but we can't rest on our laurels. Unfortunately, as I mentioned, we don't live in a utopian society. We have a lot of social ills that we need to work on. The struggle is most definitely not over. And we have to, in those famous words, we are not yet in Uhuru. We've not reached Uhuru, and a luta continua. The struggle still continues. And I think if we can draw on our networks, draw in our skill sets, draw in the legacy of the people that came before us and those that walk among us, we have a fighting chance to try and ensure that we have robust social justice movements, and that we stand behind our social justice activists, and that we ourselves become active citizens and ambassadors and social justice activists. So that's just a snapshot. I'm looking forward to the engagement, and I hope that this was illuminating in some regard. Thank you so much. Shauna, I see your hand is up.
Thank you, Natasha, for this a beautiful presentation, and for giving us a historical gaze of women activism. And I really like your contribution that women activism is a collective process. As men, we should also occupy that space so that we advocate for the reduction of femicide and also advance social rights among the girl child and women. I see Shona. I'm now opening up the floor for discussion. I see Shona, your hand is already up. If you can go ahead and make your contribution, or if you've got questions for Natasha, please go ahead.
You're on mute, Shona, sorry.
Sorry. Natasha, thanks so much. Dan, thank you for the floor. Natasha, I really enjoyed that presentation. Thank you. I have 100 questions, but I'm not going to hog the platform. I just want to begin, I just feel obliged to begin by telling you that at CCS, we have two very strong female activists. We have Vuyiseka Dubula, who was the former national secretary of the Treatment Action Campaign. She has just finished her postdoc with us, but I see she's not online today. And then we have Thandeka Hlongwane, who is the KZN manager for the Treatment Action Campaign, and she's a community scholar at Center for Civil Society. So we are very privileged to have a very, very strong and sort of next generation female South African activists that we work with. So I just want to pay them some tribute today and say how privileged I feel to be able to interact with them regularly. I'm sure Thandeka will have something to say later. Natasha, my question to you, though, what I wanted to ask, what I'm going to focus my question on is because of your legal background. So I have interviewed numerous protesters. I've interviewed women, men, very interested in current levels of social protests in South Africa. You know, we've been called the protest capital of the world. So, you know, amongst the everyday protest that goes on in South Africa are people that are directly affected by the issues that they are protesting against. So these are people who have lived experience of living informally, not having access to water, not having access to health, people who may or may have not eaten today, people who have a direct lived experience, and their activism is risen out of their own material conditions. And many of them, we've spoken about the various, you know, there was a time when the Constitutional Court in South Africa was the nexus of policymaking in this country. If you think about the Grootboom case, the TAC judgment, but there is something called the progressive realization of these socioeconomic rights that is kind of limits the amount of activism you can do around anything. If you take the Mazibuko case, the Piri case in Johannesburg, the Soweto case, where I think it was the High Court that found that 6 kiloliters of water was actually not enough water for a household, and also found that you know, putting in prepaid meters was not constitutional, but then that was immediately overturned by a higher court. I think it was overturned at the Constitutional Court. And what did they cite? Progressive realization. The same thing with the Grootboom case. If you look at it, it's a landmark. Getting a house. Yeah. Exactly. It was a landmark judgment, but it's not really changed anything because of this clause of progressive realization. So, you know, I feel that there are, well, my experience, my observations, the evidence I found in all of my research has been that this progressive realization is what puts in place limitations to a legal approach to accessing socioeconomic rights, especially by those who have the lived experiences of, the lived experience, the people who should have social justice delivered to them. So I just wanted your thoughts around that. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Well, progressive realization and within available resources, right? Those two phrases. And it is sometimes, I take your point, it is a hindrance because it gives people a chance to say, you know what, we are doing something, but is that something enough? I know that there's been, in some of the later judgments, the court has tried to do structural interdicts to at least try and ensure that there are certain benchmarks that are created within a particular time, but it is not enough. It's all very well saying you have those rights, but by then when you say within available resources and progressively realized, that is such a broad term. So we need to try and ensure that we make sense of what does that in fact mean because we're dealing with bread and butter issues, essentially when we're dealing with socioeconomic issues. So we need to be able to give bread and butter timeframes. And I think that's why, like you said, there was a time when the Constitutional Court was the pinnacle. If you got a judgment from the Constitutional Court, you'd arrived. But now we see that because of certain things such as progressive realization and within available resources, we see that protesting is happening more and more, because we can't just, what will that piece of paper do for us, right? So I take your point completely, and I think that it's very important that we focus on that so that we get some sort of clarity with regards to that. Obviously, I'm not going to sound very much like a lawyer, within a case-by-case basis, but that it is not made vague, and also that it is not a get out of jail free card. So I hope that sort of adds something to your question.
Thank you, Natasha, for that response. Is there anyone who wants to engage with Natasha? Oh, okay. Someone has raised their hands.
Ooh, 2 hands. I'm very excited.
It's Andy Siwe.
Oh.
Andy Siwe?
Yes, thank you, and good afternoon. Hi, colleagues. I'm just interested to know, I don't have a legal background, but I'm citing a lot of the women that you've given us examples of and their progressive inputs into activism. Initially, they were leaders of their own organizations, or own women-led organizations, to be specific. And I'm gathering that over time, they merged with the former organizations or struggle parties that when they joined, they were not in leadership positions. What is the reason for that? And maybe with your review, would it have been beneficial if they had retained their own structures, looking at the current challenges women are facing in these established or currently active parties, that, you know, it's quite a challenge for women to progress, and for women's issues to get the necessary support and movement that is required. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Auntie Siwe. Well, when I was researching, the reason I noted, quite interestingly, is that, for example, women were only allowed to formally join the African National Congress much later than when it started. And yes, you are correct that especially in the 19th and 20th century, these women started their own sort of groupings or organizations, and then later joined the bigger groupings. I can't give an answer for that, but what I can suggest is that it gained greater traction than, instead of having numerous smaller groupings that worked in silos, it was felt that a bigger grouping would make a greater impact. We see that these women, although when they joined these organizations, did not occupy leadership roles, but many of them then did occupy leadership roles, but by far greater roles were occupied by men. So the fact does remain that would they have created a greater impact if they stayed as women-led organizations? I firmly believe that we can't have issues and just have women deal with it. Yes, it needs to be foregrounded, but we also need to work in the society which is made up of men and women, and have a solution or ways to tackle a problem that involve men as well, especially when we look at issues that are affecting largely women, for example, femicide, gender-based violence, and so forth, where the large majority of perpetrators are men. We need to address that as well. So I think historically it was merged into larger groupings. Even within the women's sectors, we see that there were various smaller groupings that then, for example, merged into the Bantu Women's League, and then became the ANC Women's League, or the ANC generally, and so forth. I think it's just a natural progression to fight as a unified front. We see that later on, for example, with the United Democratic Front, whereby lots of groups came under general banner, you might still have certain identities that you keep, but you fight for a general cause. To draw back on the second part of your question, where you ask if it would have been better if they had stayed with women's organizations, I think that we don't live in isolation. So I think the more lobbying, the more support and to look at a problem holistically and see where men intersect. By all means, have women in leadership groups and have women speak about women's issues, but also result that we look at it holistically. And unfortunately, a large portion of those issues does involve men. I hope that answers the question somewhat.
Thank you, Natasha, for that brilliant response. Let me just abuse my position and also maybe pose a question. Right? You talked of women activism as a collective process or collective social action, but we've seen that when maybe men or other institutions they come into women activism, they sort of like an erasure of women voices. I'll just give an example. The civil rights movements in the Deep South in the 60s, they were started by women boycotting the bus rides. Then we fast forwarded to the COVID era, 2020, with the Black Lives Matter, which was led by it was led by women. But at the end of the day, global corporates became, the face of the Black Lives Matter, for example, Nike. So my question is, how can we sort of eliminate that, erasure of women voices or the capture of women activism by maybe other forces, be it corporate forces or patriarchal forces? How do we navigate that? Thank you.
Thank you so much. I don't think there's a single answer to that, but what I do think that as a baseline, we need to acknowledge that it happens, right? And then we all need to play a role in ensuring that it doesn't continue. So everybody that are in these groupings or in collectives, and it starts with you, right? And if you see that a woman's voice is being erased, especially if the majority of people then that join that grouping is of another gender, for example, you shouldn't continue with that status quo. You need to play a role in saying, you know what, we all working towards this common goal, but we're not going to erase the voices that maybe dissent or are less loud or less, because they're most definitely not less important. I think it's very important that when we look at narratives, we ensure that it's an accurate representation, and we ensure that we always check that and we don't keep quiet and we don't just go with the majority. For example, you mentioned where corporates sort of captured the voices, or when in instances where men then silence the voices of women. As a man, for example, in that instance, or those people that identify as being male, we need to then play a role and say, you know what, not going to happen, not in my name. I know that this is kind of like a wishy-washy answer, and I'm firm because I don't think that there's a one size fit all, but I do believe that it starts with us acknowledging it and us actually speaking up and not allowing it to happen. Because if more and more people speak up and don't allow it to happen, then it's going to be very, very difficult to control the narrative in that regard. And I think that that's where I really like, sometimes social media can be a curse, but it can also be a blessing because you allow dissenting voices and different voices to come to the fore as well. Yeah, so that's what I would answer to that question. Thank you.
Thank you, Natasha. I acknowledge Professor Nanapoku. You can engage with the speaker.
Thank you very much, Chair. And Natasha, thank you very much indeed for both your time and also your breadth of knowledge in trying to lead us along this inclusive conversation. I want to first endorse a comment you made, and then I've got a question more broadly for you. I want to endorse the notion that actually in discussing societal issues, it is perhaps a little bit unhelpful to genderize that debate when we're looking for collective change, because ultimately it is part and parcel of the universality of the space, the civil space we occupy. So we can't have dialogue only with those we like. We also need to engage those that are functional and those who are also not listening to us. And I very much appreciate the fact that you summed it up better than me in that regard. My question to you is this. As we move out of the past and look to the future, what are the current impediments to achieving the objective of equality among the sexes? Because I asked that, and maybe I can give you a pointer. It's increasingly less helpful to keep transnational, transdisciplinary conversations confined to boundaries of states. And with the advent of much more sort of globalized and intensified connectivity, it's better to talk about epistemic communities that span the globe, and nothing epitomizes that better than the activisms around social movements, right? So what are the impediments at the moment to the sector, would you say?
I think I take your point that we need to look at it transnationally, continent-wise, and so forth. I do think that even though that is a great worldview to have, unfortunately, there are still silos and so forth. So there needs to be an agenda whereby we work towards a common cause, but we also take into account local nuances, and we don't forget that. So globalization is great, but we don't leave people behind, and we don't leave the local nuances behind. I do think that there sometimes is a lack of buy-in for these causes. Sometimes they aren't sexy enough, for lack of a better term. Sometimes the people that they affect are so marginalized that it's felt that they don't have a voice. They're not worthy of being focused on. So I think that there needs to be better cohesion among civil society, greater working with other sectors of society, for example, with various governments and international and national groupings, and coming together with a common voice and ensuring that everyone is taken forward in this agenda, that no one is left behind, and that we also acknowledge that everyone has a voice and that it's a collective. So firstly, I would say that there needs to be buy-in from powerful actors, and to look at it and to look at all issues and to ensure that we actually have people, we represent those issues accurately, that we work cohesively, and that we make inroads that are tangible, that we don't just speak about it, that it translates into action. So that's what I think that sometimes some of the hindrances are, because there might not be a lot of buy-in. It might not seem that it's worth the cause, particularly when it affects people that really are already left behind, and that is such a travesty. I hope that answers it somewhat.
Chair, may I abuse my position as the last speaker and just do a follow-up in part to agree with Natasha?
Sure.
please go ahead, Professor. It's fine.
Natasha, part of the challenge, and I'll pull you back out of the South African purview for a moment. I agree that global norms needs to be particularized in order to get agency for change. That I think I agree with that. But the biggest challenge we're facing at the moment is, if you like, at the continental level, an assault on the libertarian order that emerged out of the Second World War. So all the people you cited around the civil rights, around the issues of suffragettes and so on and so forth, were all part of a broader push towards a post-Second World War order, premised on the rule of law, and also premised on the fundamental notion that equality needs to be prescribed and also work towards, right? If we agree on that, then I think the biggest challenge we're facing at the moment is greatly manifested in the most rawest form in Uganda, where there is now the most starkest of pernicious and draconian laws, specifically designed for me to assault the autonomy of the female, both in terms of their sexual preferences, but also in terms of the ideology of sexuality. Now, if we don't take a broader continental view in terms of the rights of both men and women in deciding their sexual preferences, and indeed in deciding their own fate, it becomes left to a localized civil society who are in themselves under assault by the state. That is where I was coming from with my question.
Yeah.
I hope I've clarified my premise.
No, you really have. But we can see how it also works both ends, with like particularly in maybe in Uganda or so forth, whereby you have outside, for example, maybe the far right of the USA and so forth, and having such a great impact on policies, and how that can also negatively affect it. So I think we need to reach a way where we have a local voice, and that local voice is really, really strong, and that civil society is strengthened, so that if there are any sort of, yes, we need outside, it needs to be globalized. I take your point there, but also that it's ensured that it's what the people want, and that civil society and so forth is representing the will of the people in that particular country, and that it's for the betterment of the people, and it's not just dictated to by the outside. I don't know if that makes sense.
For my purpose, I think you're outstanding. Thank you very much, Chair. I'll shut up and stay here.
Cool. Fabulous.
I
see that we have 4 minutes.
Yes, I'll just take one more question. If there is a question, if there's no question, maybe we can just round it off. Is there any question?
Andy Siwe.
Yes, Andy Siwe. And then we wrap it up.
Hi, it's me again. I think a previous commentator mentioned that most of the activists in South Africa, in their observation, coming from a place of lived experiences, or lived places of desperation, so that activism is their root, is one of the ways of addressing challenges. And so noting that, the discussion we are having right now, and even the exposure to the concepts of activism and the resources of activism, are those who may have the privilege of graduate or postgraduate education, and even mainly the legal sector. How then do we infuse the principles and the resources and the ideas of activism across the different schools of learning, so that if one is in healthcare or in education and they are working directly in these communities, we're capacitated to be able to have the eyes to identify these challenges, and then be equipped to navigate what resources we need to tackle, so that we can better serve our communities.
That's an amazing question, Andy Siwe, and also a great one to end on, because it's important that we then firstly realize our privilege, the fact that we could log on, we had data and so forth, and who are we talking to, right? And therefore, it's very important that we involve grassroots organizations, that we enthuse in all sectors and in all programs, that we have advocacy, that we have education, and that we work together with grassroots organizations, with community activists, with ordinary community members, and we ensure that all issues are brought to us by that particular community, that particular community takes ownership, and that we play a supporting role, but we led by the community. So it's never a top-down approach. And therefore, when any sort of way or strategy, we need to ensure that we have grassroots. We need to ensure that advocacy is essential and central, as well as education, because without that, we won't have any sort of sustainable social change. I hope that answers your question. Cool. Thank you.
Thank you, Natasha. I would like to thank everyone for joining in and having this fruitful discussion about women activism. Thank you so much, Natasha, for your time. Let me hand over to Andres. Andres? It seems as if he's now offline. Okay, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Natasha, for your time. I don't know, Shona,
Natasha.
do you want to say something?
No, just thank you, and thanks to you, Dan and Andres. Natasha, great to engage with you. I hope we can keep in touch, and thank you everybody for participating.
Thank you so much for your time. It's been wonderful.
Okay, let's see each other next week, same time.
Bye.
Okay. Thank you so much.